Hello, and thank you for joining the Hemp special session as part of the 2021 Virtual Southeast Regional Fruit and Vegetable Conference. I'm Timothy Coolong. I'm Professor of Horticulture at the University of Georgia, and I'll be the moderator for this presentation. I want to cover a few things real quick. Pesticide CEU and CCA credits are available for most presentations offered during the live Southeast Regional Conference. Check the Pesticide CEU guide for a list of approved presentations and participating states. The Pesticide CEU guide is located in the Event Resources tab under the Media player. The guide is also available at the Resources Center located on the main menu of the conference platform. Please note, pesticide credits will only be available for registered attendees and only during the live conference. Credits will not be available for later on-demand viewing. There's a simple three-step process to receive pesticide CEU and CCA credits. First, go to the audience chat box located on the left side of your screen and type in your first name, last name, and the states for which you are requesting credits. Again, you go to the audience chat box located on the left side of your screen, type first and last names and the states for which you are requesting credit. You need to do this for every presentation to get CEU credits. Now, the second step is to sign out at the end of a presentation. To sign out, go to the same audience chat box, type your first name, last name, and the states for which you're requesting credits, and you will be reminded to sign out at the end of the presentation. The third step is to complete the pesticide CEU registration. You only have to complete this registration one time during the conference. It is not required for every presentation. To access the pesticide CEU registration web link, open the pesticide CEU guide on the Event Resources tab located under the Media player. The pesticide CEU registration web link is located on the front cover of the guide. This presentation is pre-recorded in order to reduce technical difficulties. We will be answering your questions live at the end of the presentation. You may submit a question at any point during this presentation by typing your question in the questions box and pressing send. And please don't forget to thank our 2021 conference sponsors and exhibitors by visiting the virtual trade show and the featured products pavilion. And then lastly, don't forget to join us every morning for coffee chats and each evening for networking. Check the conference agenda for details. Now, again, I'll introduce myself. Timothy Coolong. I'm a professor of horticulture at the University of Georgia. And I'm going to give an industrial hemp update from the 2020 season, cover a little bit of our research and some of the common things that I saw this season working with growers. Because Dr. Gene Woodward is covering diseases, I'm not going to spend too much time on that. And Sarah Johnson is going to be covering analytics and lab and chemistry. I'm not going to cover much of that. And of course, Mike Evans will be giving an update from the state. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the horticulture issues and some of the research we've done this year. So real quick, I did want to point out that we do have a website. If people would like to go and check out the website, some of the resources we have some budget information, some production guides and so on. It's very easy if you just Google UGA hemp production. Here you see the web link on the top of the page. It's under our forage and turfgrass production links under crops, but there we have several resources for people. In addition, we have a preview of industrial hemp for flower production in Georgia. That's kind of a production guide focusing on CBD or flower, hemp for flower production. That came out late last year. It's kind of an introductory guide. So if you've been growing for a couple of years, you're probably a little bit past that, but if you're new to hemp, it would be useful for you. And then we recently had an introduction to hemp chemistry and lab results that came out over the summer, and that focuses more on the analyses that you'll be seeking as a grower and interpreting some of those. And so those are both available. We're going to work on a small fiber publication and a couple of other things in the coming months. So I want to talk about some issues I saw from the 2020 season, and one of them was uneven plant quality. We saw big differences in clones, cuttings, and plants from seed. Saw a lot of variable genetics, both in seed and clones. I visited some growers who had bought clones and had quite a bit of variation actually in the field, which was not expected. And then I think some of the variation we saw was in older plants. We ran into some issues where people were not getting, they were expecting maybe to be ready to plant and go in June, and that didn't occur until July. So some of the plants for those growers were held up. And because of that, I did see some issues overall with some unevenness in fields and plant quality. And then also many growers, due to things beyond their control, had to plant a little bit later. And this was interesting. Not all late plantings did poorly. Some of them did. It may be variety dependent, conditions, or it could just simply be older clones. And so, for example, I received some clones from a company out west in late June. I planted them around June 30th or so. And that's the top right picture on the slide. And they started flowering around August 1st, and they were very small, compact, didn't yield very well. They yielded about 0.2 to 0.4 pounds per plant, which, as you know, is not going to cut it. And, I attributed that to these were kind of older clones that got sent and they got planted late. And they just didn't have a time to establish. However, the bottom picture is actually a trial that I ran in Tifton for a seed company. They were planted in the field July 15th, did fantastic. They began flowering mid-August. That picture that I'm showing is just when flowering started. And now those were seeded later. They were seeded for about 4 weeks, so mid-June was when they were seeded, and then we planted them. So those plants were never root bound. They weren't old, they were just planted later. And so it's kind of interesting. I think there's a combination of things that are going on with some of these older plants not doing as well and some of the late plantings. I wouldn't necessarily recommend planting in July, but in this particular case, it actually worked out fairly well. Here's a couple of examples of cuttings that were held too long. These were planted in mid-July also, a different study from the one I just showed in Tifton, but these were kind of older cuttings. You can see how tall they were and stretched out. That's obviously not good. They're about 1.5 feet tall. And then, they were flowering 2.5 weeks later in August, and you can see they just don't look very good. And that's about as big as they got. They never did anything. And so, I think some of this late planting could just be with cuttings held too long. And again, some varieties just may not be conducive to a late planting. This was also a photo that a grower shared with me. These are all the same varieties, but look at the variation that's in the field. Some of the varieties actually ended up being autoflowers. They flowered out almost immediately when they were 6 inches tall, and then some others got full size. And this grower, it's a problem because now you're going to have multiple harvest dates. And obviously you would want all of your plants to be large and full. And these were reasonably well managed plants on plastic mulch. They were planted on time. But again, we did see a fair amount of variation in the genetics out there. And that was probably the biggest issue that I saw in making visits around the state. This is planted early in mid-June. The early June is on the right side on the bottom. And then the mid-June, June 11th, actually, that's our variety trial in Watkinsville, planted by the road there. You can see we hit that window pretty good, and the plants were able to put on some good growth before flowering. And so moving forward, ideally, we could target that early to mid-June window, maybe even late May, depending upon where you are in the state, because that seems to consistently give us a good, strong plant. They're not too big, but big enough to support In this case, in the variety trial, I don't have all the data crunched, but typically we were around 2,000 pounds an acre, which is more than a little bit more than a pound per plant. One other thing we ran into were nutrient analyses, and a couple of growers were nice enough to share some of their foliar analyses with me. They repeatedly were sending in leaf tissue analysis, and across the board, every single sample that I saw, probably a few dozen in total, were low in potassium. You see this particular sample, potassium is about 2.6%, it's about half that of nitrogen. In this example, the plants looked great. I visited the grower that submitted this. His plants looked good. There were no obvious issues whatsoever, and they were fertilized with an incredibly high amount of potassium. And so this is something I want to take a look at. Typically, hemp plants will start accumulating potassium fairly late in the season, and in fact, when we've sampled flower bud materials, the ratio of N to K is close to 1:1. But it's really interesting that early in the season, despite heavy fertilization and despite looking good and having ultimately ending up with good yields, we saw very low potassium. And so this is something we want to look at in the future. But I did want to point that out that it was consistent across all the samples. So if you are pulling nutrient samples early in the season, just keep that in mind. It was something that we're going to look into further. Other problems, this is actually one of the biggest issues that we had early in the season, ant damage. You can see a close up there, fire ants as well as some other ants. This was very significant for probably about a 2 to 3 week period of time. Almost all of the phone calls I got were for ants, and it wasn't just one grower, it was all across the state, all different growing methods, bare ground, plastic mulch, etc. And I mean, it was significant. And it was, last year we didn't have ant problems in our trials, but other growers from other states had reported ant problems. This was a significant issue. And really, I think moving forward next year, there's not much labeled for ants, but maybe using some baits in non-cropped areas could help. And I think doing that before planting would be important because, growers were, resorting to some treatments that were not very effective. And, because of the lack of labels, this is problematic. And so I do think looking into some of the baits again in non-crop areas and doing some things prior to planting to manage ants is going to be important moving forward. But again, this was a significant issue this year. Foliar diseases. Last year we didn't see a lot of foliar diseases, much more southern blight and root diseases. This year we saw more foliar diseases. This is actually a variety that was sent to me from a company out west. Does great out there, apparently does not like the wet conditions we have here. The photo on the left was taken in early September, and it progressed from the photo on the left to that on the right in 4 days. Just completely annihilated this particular variety. It looks almost like a Rhizoctonia web rot that we had. Interestingly, in our trials, we tended to see this massive blight, very quick moving blight. We had 4 CBG varieties, and every single one of them got hit. Now, it could have just been those 4 varieties, but moving forward, I'd like to look at this. Maybe there's a correlation. But again, this just goes to show how important it is to test varieties here in Georgia, something that may do perfectly well in the drier climate out west. Just doesn't cut it here because of our high humidity and rainfall. So I wanted to briefly cover some of our research. I've only got about 10 minutes to do that. This year we did put out some fiber hemp trials. We did 2 varieties, Jin Ma and Bial Boreski. We did 2 planting dates, May 15th and June 5th, and we did 40 and 85 pounds an acre. I'll see, you can see a picture there. We did have some uneven germination. We did seed these with a grain drill. I think moving forward, we would probably use like a monosem vacuum seeder. Grain drill worked okay, but the seed is not terribly cheap. And I like the singulation more of the vacuum seeders. But nonetheless, we did have some uneven germination. Probably our best germ was from that, or the best stand was that high 85 pound an acre rate. The Jin Ma, which is a Southeast Asian variety, performed a little bit better for us than the other variety, which is from Poland, actually. I will say weeds were an issue. Even though hemp grows pretty quickly, it doesn't grow as fast as pigweed. And these plants still took a few days to pop out of the ground, and even seeded at a pretty high density, they didn't compete as well as like a traditional cover crop would necessarily. So weeds were an issue. Here's some fiber hemp late in the season. On the left side, you can see there's both males and females there. On the right side though, a lot of those are hemp bugs, but a lot of that is pigweed, okay? If you look really close at that picture, there's an enormous amount of pigweed in that field. It's because without a good cultivation technique, these hemp plants do not jump out of the ground fast enough to take out, to outcompete something like Palmer amaranth. So definitely to do fiber, because there are no herbicides available, we're gonna have to look at some advanced cultivation techniques. Again, we're not there. It was a first trial. We learned quite a bit, but we have a long way to go. So some of the other trial work we did this year, fumigation, we did some raised beds with Pick 60 with Triest Ag. They applied this in mid-April for us. This is from our Watkinsville station, and it was 0, 200, 250, 300 pounds. Those are the broadcast rates. What went out was obviously much less, under a pretty heavy TIF plastic. We had two varieties in here, Vaughn and the Wife. The Vaughn was a seedling and the Wife was a cutting. In our trial, we didn't have any differences in nut sedge coming through the plastic, but keep in mind, this trial was done up here in Watkinsville. That picture on the left is a non-fumigated control plot where I peeled plastic away. And you can see that we have relatively low nut sedge pressure. On the right is plastic I laid in Tifton this year, and this is actually plastic from those pictures I showed from that hemp. This was non-fumigated PE plastic, and you can see the nut sedge pressure in South Georgia. So we were not dealing with that level of pressure in this trial. We did see a yield increase in our fumigated rows. You can see my results here. The Pick 60, the control had about 1,472 pounds, but fumigated with 200 up to 300 pounds, we were in the 1,700 to 1,800 pound range. And so we did pick up a few hundred pounds an acre in yield, and we also saw higher vigor in those plants. We did not see a significant difference in disease levels, but I will say that our disease was very low in these plots this year. I really cut back on the irrigation, and we did a good job with our soil-borne diseases this year. And so I think maybe on a larger trial, and this was a pretty big trial, but I think if you had more disease pressure, you may see a difference. But we did see a yield effect. We did not see a difference between the two varieties. They were very similar in terms of yields, around 1,700 pounds each. We also did some tarp fumigation, and I understand that tarp fumigation, it's more common like for sod fields and so forth. We don't use it a whole lot in veggie scenarios, but I did want to cover this because it provided excellent weed control. It was the first time I was able to help participate in the tarp fumigation. Here's folks from Triest laying that tarp in Watkinsville. Did 250 and 300 pounds an acre, Pick 60 under the tarp, and then a zero control. We did plant this later. We had a COVID outbreak in our department, and so I pretty much planted all of the trials myself this year, and it just took a while, planting every day. So I didn't get this particular trial planted until June. And so the tarp was on there from, about 6 weeks. Obviously, it gassed off before then, but it was on there for a while. Here's a picture. We did whole fields. We did overhead and drip irrigation. Excellent weed control in the fumigated plots. You can see on the picture on the left side of your screen, you'll see a blue line painted and then a bunch of weeds. And you can see that's basically the zero control, full of weeds. And then you'll see basically that's where we start to turn off the knives at that, where that line is. And before that, with the 250 and 300 pounds an acre, very, very good weed control. On the right side is a photo of the drip field. And this is actually before we weeded it. And you can see just a few grass weeds here and there, nothing much, but you can see it made a dramatic effect. Here's drip late in the season, tarped. We weeded this one time, and basically we weeded it to collect data for trial results. But you can see, I mean, excellent weed control, and the plants did well. Triest also did a complementary trial on a private farm in Moultrie, and this is a picture from that farm. This row middle was cultivated, but between the rows, by and large, stayed very clean. This was also tarped, bare ground drip tarped. And then you can see this, I just put this up here. We did not see a difference in yield, but this was big fields. It wasn't replicated. It was just a single big field. But just if you take a look at the weeds, our overhead irrigated is on top of this table. We picked and weighed all the weeds, 600 pounds of weeds and 1,000 square feet. Those that were fumigated, 14 and 17 pounds of weeds per 1,000 square feet. And then the drip, as you would expect, had far fewer weeds, 100 pounds of weeds in the control, but 8 pounds of weed. I mean, weeds, that's basically a couple of crabgrass plants in 1,000 square feet. Very good weed control. I was very happy. And even though it wasn't, we didn't do statistics on it, you can see the drip there, the yield was considerably higher under the 250 and 300 pound treatments. Here's a bed fumigated in Moultrie, Georgia, again on a private farm where I conducted a variety trial, and you can see pretty good weed control in the rows there as well. Here's a bare ground pivot field that was over in East Georgia, Tatnall, Candler County. Excellent weed control here. This particular grower was cultivating and did do some hand weeding. But the reason I'm showing these pictures is because plastic certainly, I think, does play a role, but I don't believe that it's absolutely essential, especially with some of the other weed management methods, cultivation, potentially doing some fumigation and so on. And so if you don't want to use plastic, I don't necessarily think you have to. Of course, it does certainly help with weeds in row, particularly in North Georgia, where we don't have the nut sedge pressure. So I understand that was very quick because of the time constraints here. I can't jump into everything. We also did some planting date trials this year with autoflower material. We did drying trials where we looked at different drying techniques, and I'll have a lot of that information available if we do county meetings and so forth this winter. There's a picture of our hemp. We dried it in a high tunnel this year due to a lack of space. Hand stripped every single bit of it, put plastic on the ground to keep moisture from coming up through the soil. Worked fairly well. We had a little bit of browning, and I think that was due to the sunlight hitting things, but hand stripped it all. Just want to say thank you to Triest Ag Group, Mr. John Ladson and Sunbelt Hemp Source for helping out tremendously this summer. Mr. Barry Smith and Joe Hartsock provided plants for a lot of my trials. It was a huge help, several $1,000s worth of plants. Jeremy Kickler, county agent, Colquitt County, helped out a lot with the on-farm trials there, as well as Mr. Tim Flanders, who many of you know. He did some scouting and was always giving me calls, keeping me updated on things. Georgia Farm Bureau provided the bulk, pretty much all of my funding for this year. And so I really want to say thank you to them. help pay for fuel, plastic, drip tape, all those sort of things that go into this trial. S&W Seeds helped fund some trials in Tifton, and I'm very appreciative of that. And also Noelle Fuller, Tom Bagney, and Amanda Marabisi, who work with me here at UGA on the hemp program. And so with that, I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.